Hello and welcome to a first of 14 or so pre-recorded series of me playing some advanced squad leader. The idea for this series is to basically have some sort of primer for an LP that I'll probably only do on Twitch. The basic idea will be that I will be playing one day of a multi-day campaign, and then once it moves over to Twitch, I'll be able to do, I guess, just interaction with anybody who's watching, obviously. Um, and just because, well, my normal means or methods for LPs just make this a really time consuming project. And you'll see why the further we get along into this game. Now, for the uninitiated, Advanced Squad Leader is a war game or tactical war game that came out, I believe, in the 80s, if not earlier than that. It's basically so it started out with Squad Leader and then became Advanced Squad Leader later on. But the basic gist is that it works around a very simple system, in my opinion, and has had a lot of chrome added after the fact. Depending on who you ask, some people enjoy the chrome, some people don't. There's a lot of ways to not only interpret how the rules react, in the sense that everything you do in the game should have some sort of basis in the rules. But also, things you may not expect to be in a board game also can exist, as long as you happen to find it wherever it may be in the rules. For example, lightning strikes and crazy stuff. The basic setup for this comes from a recently released expansion that came out. Multi-Man Publishing is the group that does all of the production for this game in particular, but also a couple other ones as well. They're the ones that basically push out official products. This specific official product is the Red Factories expansion. Red Factories takes up from where Red Barricades left off, which was basically this initial part of the LP will be Red Barricades, and existed way back in the day. But there were, with board games in particular, after initial print runs and some extra runs, you kind of run out of your product because it costs a lot to make. You got to set it up. Going to a printer and getting everything set up so that they can print many copies, and how much of a production run do you do? Where do you store all of those board games that you've now made? Can you sell the product? What's the price point? All these sorts of things obviously come into play, so it makes it a little hard for somebody who has not already gotten into ASL to sort of dig into some of the older modules. For example, I don't have very many British counters because they're supposed to reprint the British module at some point. And I think this was mentioned like 6 years ago. So it's one of those unfortunate hang-ups that players come across with ASL. But to get back to this game in particular, Red Factories builds off of Red Barricades. Like I said, it originally came out a long time ago, but it added what's called Red October, which is the second partner module to Red Barricades. If you combine the two, you can have a campaign game that basically spans the entire map that we saw. Currently, I'm just going through a bunch of the available counters in Vassal, which is the program that people use to play this game against each other or against themselves, which is what I will be doing. And just it goes to show that all of these counters have some sort of physical representation. None of these counters, these counters are all existent. You could, depending on which module you buy and find, you could find those counters. So there's a lot of fluff. There's a few other things I'm showing off, just a lot of the tables. A lot of it seems very daunting, but don't worry. Once you get the basics down, it goes by quickly. As long as you don't forget some basic rules like I do from time to time. The Vassal VASL also has a lot of nice extensions that you can do. For example, you can get an extension for secret dice rolls, which basically mean that dice roll will stay hidden, and your opponent will be notified that someone has made a roll for something, but you won't know what it is for or what the number, like what the result is. So they're very handy because you need to do some secret dice rolls, and you sometimes can't be trusted, I guess, to have people just roll physical dice and then tell you what an answer is. With a lot of the functionality of Vassal VASSAL, the Vassal module in Vassal, it gets confusing, I know, has a lot of handy tools such like a line of sight drawer. Unfortunately, the line of sight only works for maps that have been programmed for it. So you have to actually go into the code, or not the code, but you have to actually tell the Vassal which hexes can see where. Obviously, when it comes to bigger maps like these, that gets really time consuming for the guys who make the maps. And so sometimes you'll see them flat out omitted. The setup I have, I believe, is Campaign Game 1, which is the basis for, I think, Campaign Game 3, and eventually Campaign Game 3 mixes in with one of the campaign games from Red October. Now, my eventual goal, because I like these stupidly huge campaign games, even if I play just myself, I like being able to effectively make a huge campaign that's super drawn out, and even if you kind of break the functionality in like going to an area before, it just means you would then unlock that area earlier than you normally would, and so on. So this game is this campaign is built around Stalingrad. It might not be completely obvious, but the blue counters that we have are the Germans, and the like orange, like dark orange, brown, like not really brown, but going into a brown counters are the Russians. There's a lot of different things that apply to the setup in this game. And in fact, I believe for this first turn I went through the advanced sequence of play just to go through every single step. If there's enough people that really want me to go through that again, just because I was just reading off to make sure like I fully understood all the different parts. If they want me to do that during the Twitch streams, I can. There's nothing stopping me, and I have access to a digital format of the rulebook, so it makes searching stuff a lot easier. Because, as one might imagine, the rulebook for this game is very thick, even though a healthy portion of that may just be for all the different unit counters, because each different unit counter has its own entry, infantry not included. Just to tell people, like, these are the special things that could happen, and so on and so forth. Here I am posting about one of the best rules in this game. I wish more games had this. ASL is not a fast game. You can play it quickly, but I don't believe that it's intended to be something that you can do. Like, you're not playing this game in a 30-minute time span. It's just not possible. And because of that, and because of all the calculations, you'll be rolling dice a lot. It's possible to get confused by something that is in the rules or that you may have missed in the rules. You're not supposed to expect your players to be, gods among board game players. So if you happen to miss something, that's fine. Just play through it. If you if you think you can go back and play it or whatever, then you might as well. But don't feel like you should get hung up too much on all of the nitty-gritty stuff. Obviously, if you're playing at a much higher level, say like a tournament level, you're going to want to make sure that you're not performing such errors, because that can get you penalized. Or, for example, if you're missing stuff that is critical and your opponent picks up on it, they can call you out on it. You can get in a lot of, I don't want to say trouble, but just your play suffers if you don't fully take advantage of the rules or take advantage of your opponent's lack of their either understanding of the rules or playing it in a way that would help out. Thanks GeForce for letting me know there's an update. Another thing that Vassal does is it allows you to do dice rolls. We have a bunch of different categories of dice rolls. They all serve technically their own purpose, but keep in mind this is specifically a Vassal thing. When you're playing physically, you just have 2 dice. That's all that really matters. So we have DR capitalized is a dice roll, as in 2 dice. IFT is an infantry fire table attack. TH is a 2-hit check. 2 TK is a 2-kill check. MC is a morale check. TC is a task check. Rally is a rally attempt. CC is close combat, so melee also falls into that, but we'll talk about that later. DR non-capitalized is 1 die, so you're only rolling 1 dice. And SA is sniper activation, and RS is random selection. Now, all these will come into play, so don't worry if I skip a thing or two every now and then. Currently, we've gone from the rally phase to the prep fire phase. The rally phase doesn't really apply in the first turn of most scenarios, because you're basically trying to get broken units back into fighting condition. There's a couple things you want to check. For example, the dice roll I did was for weather. There was no change. We'll get to that some other time. And then if you're trying to repair stuff and a couple other minor actions, you can do that in the rally phase. But again, it doesn't apply, so we don't have to worry about it too much. In the prep fire phase, that's when you start to be able to do a couple things. If you have units that are already on the map, which we do not, you can start shooting it at your opponents. Shooting obviously is a big component of this game, and it's something that you'll want to invest in a lot of time just in thinking how you want to conduct your fire attacks. In the initial scenario for this campaign, the Germans are allotted an 80mm mortar artillery. Now, you could request more. I don't, because I don't think it's necessary to have. I do mess up a couple of things, so I'll try to point out my own errors. And please, if you notice that I've done something wrong, please, if you can, comment. If not, I will have a thread on Something Awful about this. Because honestly, it's always fun for me to learn, and I like knowing how to better improve my own play. So, for artillery, thankfully there is an OBA, or off-board artillery flowchart, that is added as an extension. If you want to download that, I will have some links in the Something Awful thread about it. But basically, it goes through all of the major steps for your off-board artillery. The first thing you want to do is to check if you have contact with your artillery unit, because it supposes that you have like a telephone or radio, something to contact the guys in the back with the big guns to lay down some fire on your target. In this campaign, you start off and you're allowed to have 2 pre-registered hexes. Basically, this improves your chance of hitting your target, but we'll get into that a little later. The main thing to check after you draw battery access, which is like the 3rd step in the entire process, is to make sure that your off-board observer can actually see his target. Now, there's a lot of stuff we can cover when it comes to line of sight, but don't worry, we'll get to that eventually. Normally, the range is supposed to show up. However, the Vassal just doesn't calculate range between an off-board position and an on-board position. You'd have to continue hexes, and it just doesn't work that way, sadly. However, once you draw the chip necessary to actually get access, you check to make sure you have line of sight on your target. Once you do, you can put in an artillery request. Once that artillery request goes through, you then have to check to make sure that you can actually see anybody. The idea is that if your off-board observer doesn't see anybody, if there's no reports of people shooting from those buildings, if you can't see anybody poking their head out of the building, then do you really want to waste ammunition on, shooting at an empty target? You kind of have to suppose things with certain rules. And also think of it as like what would happen in real life type idea. Obviously, in real life, the Germans lose. Hopefully, I won't just cut to the chase and sacrifice a bunch of them, even though way back when probably deserved it. Well, more than deserved it. But anyways, before I devolve into like some political or historical piece. So at this point, I'm just checking rule after rule, because off-board artillery isn't something that new players are introduced to quickly, or at least they shouldn't. And this isn't as a detriment or to say something negative about new players, but again, ASL is a very complex game, so at a certain point, it just becomes too much to absorb for a new player, and it's better to just start them off easy. This is why multi-man publishing, I guess recently, compared to the entire span of Advanced Squad Leader's history and library, they recently came out with a bunch of starter kits. So if you don't feel like you want to spend, say, $100 or $100 plus on the first module that will give you, more than everything you need to play, you can get a starter kit for like a third of the price. Try it out. Try the system out. If you don't like it, whatever, it's a minimum investment. If you do like it, hooray, you can move on to bigger, better things. So, because artillery is something that's not often used, especially myself, there's a couple things that, while I have played with it a bit, lack of use or lack of any sort of fresh play experience just means that it'll end up being a little tougher for me to make sure that I know all the rules in play. For example, there will be a very big one that will come up that I didn't realize because it's just one of those things that's kind of snuck in at a different spot in the rulebook. I didn't notice it, and eventually I corrected, but we're talking like 6 episodes in, so it's a little annoying considering how I played things out, and then we got to this point, or future point. So the idea with the artillery request, there's some of that you can do. For the purposes of this video, I have a barrage type fire mission, as they call it, and I have just a regular one at my red spot. So a barrage, basically what it does is it'll attack, it'll cause an attack to occur within 9 hexes, but in a straight line. Now, because this is hexagonal sides, straight line can be, more of a suggestion sometimes. You cannot do anything diagonally, but you can do from left to right, top to bottom. So in our case, unfortunately, we can only go north to south. This is to derive from the historical positioning of the battle at Stalingrad, where it would have made a lot more sense. Well, it makes a lot more sense when you look at the strategic location of everything, as the Germans would have their artillery on at the west portion of this map, obviously way far and off map, while the Russians would have had all their artillery across the Volga River to the east. So you don't really have, it gets really hard to coordinate a east-west attack, like fire mission, if, well, you know, you're kind of asking a lot in terms of calculations and all that. And for the game purposes, it's just easier to do north-south and also make sense historically. Now, a barrage versus a regular fire mission falls down to preference. Technically, I could have probably put a fire mission where the big counter is, in Hex G6, as there seems to be a huge concentration there. However, unbeknownst to, I guess, the Russian player, the German player has to pick pre-registered hexes before they choose to do anything. So, before the Russian player puts any of his hexes or counters on the map, the German has to choose where exactly he wants his artillery to fall, which makes sense. But it also means that it gets very hard for a German player to sort of assume where he should or should not put his artillery. The best advice I could give is to try and find, try to look at the map from both sides. I know it's a technique that some people use in tournaments and just for casual play as well. Whether it's to look at the map from a defender's position like we are right now, or to flip the map upside down and look at the map as from the attacker's point of view, rather than just overhead. Determining the orientation, like changing the orientation of the map, can really help just in looking at what your avenues of approach should be or are, or where you will go and how you will move through things. So I've been going back and forth through the artillery rules because, again, it gets really confusing. We want to determine if the artillery fire is accurate, if the artillery request will be accurate. And because I rolled a 3, it's fine. If you, normally for Germans it's a 2, and you add a +2 if it is on a pre-registered hex. So because I rolled a 3, it means I passed. One error I make here is that my artillery request, the extra chit I drew, because there are two types of chits, there's black and red. If you draw a red chit, it will usually cancel out your fire mission or just deny you access. There's one rule, one of the main rules for artillery requests is that if you draw a red chit and it is for the extra draw, which is what I just did, and we saw it in the OBA flowchart, an extra draw does not count for your permanent number of red chits drawn. And the reason for this, or the reason why this is important, is because if you draw a red chit, it'll cancel out your request, as previously mentioned. But if you draw a second permanently removable red chit, you are denied access to your artillery, period. So if I drew, let's say my first draw was a red, and then in my next turn I try to draw again and I draw another red, I don't get artillery. Anything I could have wanted to do with my artillery goes away. And it is assumed that there are, in a sort of historical sense or whatever, that the battery that is providing such support is required elsewhere, for whatever reasons. Again, it makes a lot more sense playing Advanced Squad Leader if you sort of get the meaning behind all the decisions that are taken with regards to what certain rules mean. Snipers are a great example of this, as you wouldn't be able to... it's very hard to properly simulate snipers in such a chaotic environment as a battlefield, and how do you really show off their interactions? So the way that the game does it is that it calculates, it takes a number that is determined through play and testing, and says if player A rolls X number and it'll trigger the opponent's sniper. Then they roll to see if they activate, then a random selection sometimes, see if it does anything, and go ahead. Excuse me. And the idea with snipers is that they sort of simulate a background entity that could cause chaos in some form or fashion. So since my artillery couldn't actually activate, I'm now finally in the move phase for the Germans. There's many different things that need to be understood with regards to the movement. Basic unit movement is 4 points, so you have 4 movement factors, as they are called. For vehicles, it's different, but infantry, you get 4 movement factors. This can be increased by 2 if a leader is stacked with that unit. So a good example is the 9-1 Sturmkoi leader that we see next to hexes A8 and A9, and we have a bunch up north as well. There's also something called declaring CX, or counter exhaustion. That basically also gives you an added movement bonus. So a normal unit would see their movement factors go up to 6 if they do not have a leader, and 8 if they do. Now, all these different hexes that we see have different movement values attributed to them. The ones with a bunch of pockmarks are shell holes. Now, those don't count for anything extra unless you choose to have your units go into those shell holes. Personally, because I need to capture stone buildings here, as determined, as we can see with the gray buildings and gray structure-like hexes, those are the hexes I need to occupy. So, for all intents and purposes, there's certain hexes that I will not want to dilly-dally in, even if they might give me a bonus. Because depending on the terrain that the hex occupies, or the hex has that your unit occupies, it may infer a bonus, a defensive bonus, or negate offensive bonuses by the enemy. For example, we have a militia unit here, 426 conscripts. They're not very strong, but used properly, they can do some damage. My entire idea with this guy is to basically cause the Germans to not be able to move as quickly as they might want. So for here, the militia has a firepower of 4, a range of 2, and a morale of 6. Hence 426. If a unit attacks point blank range, or adjacent, I should say, because point blank is actually a different thing. But if you are adjacent to each other, your firepower is doubled. So instead of 4, that conscript is shooting at an 8. So on the IFT table, we would look at the 8 column. Now, I rolled a 9. However, you have to decrease that dice roll by 2. The first being that those Germans are not moving it as an assault move, meaning they don't simply move one hex and then end. And it also has to be a declared thing, by the way. So they move 2 hexes, so they are not moving it as a non-assault or as an assault move. So that's a -1 to the dice roll. As well as the hex that they are currently in is considered open ground. So that is another negative that you apply to that number. Since I rolled a 9, it goes down to 7, and the result is actually a 1 MC, meaning a morale check with a +1 modifier. So because of that, I rolled a 9, which breaks that unit. Now, a unit that breaks just means that they flipped over to the back side of the counter. We can see a number there, that's their morale. And we also have a DM counter that's applied to them. Basically what this means is that if that unit happens to survive a second turn, or if it manages to rout away and doesn't die, the Germans can attempt to rally them. However, that rally attempt will have a +4 modifier to it. Here we're seeing that I'm now advancing a second unit to the same location. The Russians rolled a 9. However, because they are shooting at 4, and the reason for this is that on a subsequent, if you take a second shot, it basically, excuse me, basically it acts as a, you have to look at it in terms of like people actually shooting. So let's say people are shooting at some Germans, and some other squad is moving up, say behind them or slightly afterwards. Those guys might be reloading. They might have to, maintenance their weapons, that sort of stuff, in a way that now has effectively reduced their firepower. And unfortunately, that gave me a task check result, a pin task check result, anyways, and I failed it, which means that those guys are now pinned, so they can't move anymore, and the movement phase is done for them. Going into a building takes 2 movement factors to do. So this 548 that I'm now looking at and is going to be shot by a submachine gun company unit is now expended all of its move, and it's taken 2 to get there. So the SMG group is firing on the 5, which is doubled to 10. However, because I don't use the incremental infantry fire table because I hate it, it means that shot goes back down to 8 rather than 10, because there's no 10 column, so obviously it can't be that. So the fire goes down to 8. There is a -1 for not assault movement, but because they are in a building, it's not treated as open ground. So there's a -1. So it was an 8 on 8, an 8 on 8, which apparently is a pin test check. Or sorry, I don't know why I did a test check. This is a thing that I'm going to see like in my replays. The next unit moves up, and leader, I decide not to shoot with any of the Russians, so I move up the leader as well. There's bonuses to moving units as a stack, as I've said before with the leader, because they can provide increased movement. However, you always have to calculate exactly how you want to move stuff, because if you move things in a big stack, they happen to take a shot and you're not lucky, all of them could break, and now you have to wait 1 or 2 turns just to do something with those units now. Another thing that you will see a lot of are support weapons. One such support weapon is the DC that we see on the lower stack right now, or the LMG that I'm now moving. An LMG, for the uninitiated, is a light machine gun. In game terms, we can see that it has 3 firepower and 8 range. Obviously, a support weapon wouldn't have any sort of morale. And these can be very useful to have. Not only because as support weapons, I'm forgetting the DC here. As support weapons, these things can, they're additional firepower that your units can carry with you. I'm just checking to make sure that the DC was with the leader. And sometimes selection stuff gets a little wonky with Vassal, sadly. So support weapons obviously support, and you want to make sure that you get proper use out of them, because it is possible for them to break, get destroyed, and etc. So if you don't play with them properly, you could have such an additional firepower. Say the DC, which has 30 firepower, which is amazing, but you have to get really close with them. So you want to make sure that good units get access to those sorts of items. Now, with this SMG group, I don't think I'm going to want 30 firepower to just sit next to me. So I'm going to take a second shot with them, which means that they double because they're adjacent to 10. But because it's a second shot in this this movement phase, it means that it gets halved. So 10 back down to 5, which is a 4, because you always go lower, unless specifically stated otherwise. So I'm rolling on the 4. There's a -1 for non-assault movement, but a +2, or a +1 for the debris. So that cancels it out, so it's a straight 5 on 4, as the parlance goes, which means a 1 MC. And I roll boxcars. Thankfully, Vassal, the Vassal module has a lot of stuff pre-built into it, such as it telling me there's a casual VC. What this means is that not only does that unit break, but it also gets reduced to a half squad. I don't think I really need to mention what the difference is between a squad and a half squad. There's half as many guys. They also have reduced stats. So a half squad won't necessarily perform as well as a complete squad. There was one thing I just missed, however, and that's the fact that that boxcars is actually a high enough number to have triggered the ELR. I believe that stands for Experience Loss Replacement. I think. I always forget what exactly it stands for. The basic thing is that if a unit ELRs, as we commonly say, instead of they decrease in quality. Take it as enough units, enough of the guys that are experienced have either died, or their morale has shaken to a point where they are no longer confident in their own abilities. This can get very dangerous because a unit that ELRs never has any of his stats increase. It's not possible. Like it wouldn't make sense if they could. So at some point, something will decrease, whether that's the firepower, the range, or the morale. And generally speaking, they will lose some sort of morale, which is bad because it means that any other subsequent attacks are that much more powerful because you have less chance to roll under the number required. Another thing that should be mentioned is that aside from the overlays, you can only shoot so many times. The defender can only shoot so many times as the attacking units use movement factors. For example, if this rifle company takes 2 movement factors to move from their original hex to the destination hex, so say A2 to B2, then the militia company here can shoot the first time for the first move factor expended to get, towards that hex, and a second time once you calculate the second move factor into that hex. And I believe all modifiers will apply because that would normally apply because the unit hasn't actually reached that hex, and the protective qualities of it, they still get those negative modifiers for, say, non-assault movement and so on. Not open ground though. That's different. But if you play this along, or you hear me talk about this long enough, you'll understand the nuance between the two. Now, obviously, big squads will generally mean a good thing for me. If we're talking about the defenders, of course, because it gives the Russians something juicy to target. I should mention, though, I don't want to say it was an error, but it's something that you should, if you're playing, you should pay attention to. When you're checking line of sight, it is implied that, unless it's a free line of sight check, which we'll get into at some point, I'm sure, but if you do a line of sight check, it's implied that your units are actually shooting at that location. This is to prevent people from saying, do I have a shot at this location? Hold on, I'm going to do a line of sight check. But you wouldn't, if you can't tell, then assume that your little cardboard men on the board also can't tell. There's a couple of nuts things that also apply to line of sight. Namely, certain hexes with certain things block line of sight. For example, when shooting and checking line of sight, you're checking from the middle of a hex to the middle of a hex. There are very few exceptions to this, but in general, you're counting from the middle to the middle. And what that eventually does, or what that signifies, is that if your line of sight happens to go over something, and also this was a really bad, I was surprised that they got that roll, but I'll get surprised by my rolls a lot. For example, here is a straight up kill. That unit is dead because I rolled a 3 and it's decreased by 2, so it's a 1, which is it was a 1 KIA or something, which means no matter what, one unit dies outright, and all the other units in that stack would have broken immediately. You don't have a save on that one. So that unit is now dead, and that 467 is the first casualty of this campaign. So getting back to the line of sight, you check from middle to middle, and if that line of sight, that red line, draws over a building, some orchards, some trees, as we see in AA4 on the right, and any sort of other obstacle, it's possible that could either prevent line of sight going into that hex, or it could apply some sort of modifier, like a -1 or a +1 to the shot. And I don't know why I'm putting a DM on that guy. I'm pretty sure he should have died, but anyways. No, I think he should have died. And now I'm just doing some counter maintenance because that's what you do. I should also be rolling for sniper activation right now. Why did I just say he breaks? I think what I did is I turned him into a half squad and then broke him. And I believe on an elimination it just kills the unit outright, but I guess I'll have to double check just to make sure. And yeah, I should have rolled my sniper activation, because that if the Russian player rolls the sniper activation number for the Germans get their sniper. If the Germans roll the sniper activation number for the Russians get their sniper. But if the German player rolls its own sniper activation number, it doesn't get it. You can't trigger your own sniper. It's meant to be a sort of, I guess, equalizer, in the sense that if the Russian player feels so daring as to keep shooting, it may be unrealistic to see a lot of 3s come out. But for every really good roll that your opponent might get, it might trigger your sniper, which then could get its own good roll and do some nasty things, towards you. When it comes to line of sight, the reason why this rifle company unit isn't being shot at is because the debris field that they're in, as signified by the gray scratches or whatever, the brown ones are basically wooden, whereas the gray ones are meant to be some sort of remnants of concrete buildings and such. Basically, the entire hex can block line of sight to same level units. So the militia company unit in N2 can't actually see the guys over in J1. It's impossible for them to see. And that sort of debris field also adds a modifier to dice rolls. Now, the thick gray lines that we see next to those debris fields are walls. I don't fully take advantage of walls at the moment. more or less just because I haven't played with enough of them, and I don't have a really good grasp on all the different things I can do with them. There's such a thing as wall advantage, and how a wall applies its modifiers to stuff. It's just I need to play more, basically, which is an eternal struggle with Advanced Squad Leader, sadly. Another thing I should mention is that if you happen to have one unit move, stop, and then you move a second unit, you can't move that first unit anymore. But if that first unit was shot at, and I forgot that I got double axis sniper activation numbers, but if the second unit moves in and somebody else shoots at them, the entire stack doesn't get affected, only the moving units. This differs from a different phase where that sort of thing actually applies. Now, crews, which is what that unit is, and why they have a different look, not only to squads but also half squads. Crews don't ELR, and I think I forgot that for some reason. And I remembered my 2 snipers. So we can see that the first sniper roll I rolled did nothing. A 4 doesn't activate anything. You can only activate on a 1 or a 2, as seen above. Now, both the 1 and 2 result provide different results, so you have to be careful. You have to make sure you know which is happening. Thankfully, again, Vassal covers me here. And thankfully, one of the nice things is that there's a lot of, in certain cases with dice rolls and special dice rolls, you'll see that it'll provide you the rule reference as to what you should look for. Because, say, a sniper attacking a sniper gets to be, I don't want to say weird, but it's kind of a weird interaction that you don't really ever get to see. Now, because I only just realized this, when you have 2 snipers on the field, you should roll 1 dice, and if it's lower than 3, it's the eastern one, and if it's higher than 3, it's the western one, I think. Or like north-south one, I forget. At some point, I will change this so that I roll a dice twice, left to right, in terms of where the sniper positions are, and whoever rolled higher doesn't get chosen, basically. It's not exactly how you should use them, but regardless, it doesn't really affect play all that much. Now, when you have a sniper, you have to you roll a dice to see where he goes. In this case, I rolled a 4, a colored 4, and a white 6. So on the sniper counter, you would move in the direction of the 4, 6 hexes, which is what I did, and then you go to the nearest enemy unit. If there are multiple targets, you pick the one that has the least defensive bonuses. So in terms of what's called terrain effect modifiers, you'd pick the one with the worst of that. Now, sadly for me, a 2 only pins a unit, and it's automatic. You don't get to save versus that, because you're already rolling to activate it in the first place. However, if you do have multiple units in the same hex, you would roll to see random selection for that specifically. Again, if you happen to have multiple hexes with the same terrain effect modifiers, so if I had, say, like 3 hexes that everybody was in stone buildings, and therefore had +3, everybody there, then it's the attacking player's discretion, and I shouldn't say attacking, but it's the player whose sniper activated. You get to choose. So if you know or suspect that there's one of those units that is a leader or stacked with the leader or something along those lines, you'll probably want to take a shot on them, because leaders are very critical in this game. Another thing that's shown off, and thankfully in my first session I got through a lot of these like interesting things. We see an 8 result, but it was on doubles. So what it means is that a unit that rolls doubles will cower, and what that does is it shifts the attack one column to the left. So if that unit was had 4 firepower, it would have shot 4, and then it would have actually, I think I shot twice. So I would have rolled the first time for 4. I didn't get a good result. I rolled again because the unit had to spend 2 movement factors in there. Rolled an 8 but cowered. So because it was a subsequent fire, it divides its firepower by half, or by 2. So it went from 4 to 2, and then cowered to and effectively shifted it 1 to the left. So it then rolled. It was basically shooting on a 1 firepower. Here I'm showing off how Rifle Company B unit took a task check, but the task check was, after all, its own player's sniper activation, which you can't do. So I don't roll for sniper activation. And here, again, I get really lucky, but it's not going to do much because it's on the 1 firepower. It's a subsequent fire, so it's 4 down. Actually, sorry, that'll actually be 2, I think. So it's subsequent, and it's adjacent. So you would double to 8, half to 4, and then cower down to 2. And because that was a good enough result, it breaks that unit. I also have to mention that I roll. It doesn't matter if I'm playing with physical dice or not. My dice rolls for Advanced Squad Leader always seem to be very poor, unless they're criticals. But really, though, that's just a lot of the fun of it. I also forgot to put a first fire counter on the Rifle Company in P3. Again, this is something that, like, when you're playing, you kind of don't realize it sometimes. And this is why the rule A2 exists. Technically, not putting a first fire counter on him is an error. If I was playing against if I was playing against an opponent that wasn't just myself, they would have noticed that. They would have said, "Hey, you mind putting a first fire counter?" And oh, sorry, I didn't realize it. Yeah. Put it on, keep going. Another thing I'm doing here is I'm going to show off Final Protective Fire. So Final Protective Fire, basically what it does is it counts as a subsequent first fire, but that roll counts as a morale check versus the conscript unit. So, again, for the purposes of the attack, you're doubling your attack up to 8 in this case. You half it because it's subsequent first fire down to 4, and then you apply anything else that the dice roll and dice roll modifiers apply. If I get doubles and I get a cower, it'll go down to 2. Because I'm shooting at 4 firepower, I'm shooting at a guy who's moving in open terrain. It's not assault movement, and it's open ground. So there's a -2 to that roll. And this is, at this point, I'm just checking the rule to make sure I completely understand that Final Protective Fire has that morale check inherently built into the attacking unit's declaration. It might seem a little silly for me to be doing this with these units, because why would you want to throw away units? Why do you want to risk this sort of thing? There is a small point to that criticism, in that I probably should have deployed some units. Deploying basically just means that I would split them into half squads. You can only do that up to a certain percentage of your attacking force, so you have to keep that in mind. But it does help, because losing a half squad isn't as bad as losing a complete squad, as we've seen before. So using half squads to effectively run up through smoke or through whatever, take fire from the enemy, and then your bigger guys can go through, can be very advantageous. And I just rolled a 3 or a 4 on 4, so that's a 1 morale check. I know I'm doing a little bit of the exaggerating, like, hey, here's my mouse, this is what I'm doing. I usually play with music on, and I will probably be putting some, I guess, free music in the background to these videos. Obviously, because I don't want them to get taken down and get copyright strikes. Excuse me. But there's just, like, how do I put this? I usually listen to music, and I figure when I do this on Twitch, I'll probably have a little bit of music in the background. But if I have some music in the background in the YouTube videos and they're free or whatever, at least it'll give people who might have it muted or whatever an idea as to where I'm looking with my mouse, and what the checks, what visual checks, and what I'm looking at, basically. The Russian unit got pinned. Normally speaking, you wouldn't ever see a unit on the defense get pinned in an attack. That only happens under some very rare cases, and also in Final Protective Fire, because that morale check, the roll of 6 was a morale check that they took. You don't get any modifications from from TEM, if I recall correctly. And 6, if a unit rolls equal to their morale on a morale check, they get pinned. So even though you might pass, nothing negative might happen to you in the sense that you won't lose that unit for a turn or whatever. It does mean that they don't move anymore, which can be very detrimental in locations where you might now be stuck in the middle of nowhere. Those guys can't move, and then the Russians in this case would be able to follow up with another attack and wipe them out. Oh, is this time where I start moving tanks? There's such a thing called armored assault. And armored assault basically allows the player to have infantry units and their tank to move at the same time. It can be very powerful to have, especially because the infantry get a +1 modifier to any attacks against them. Which means that under the right circumstances, you can have them not piggyback, but at least take advantage of the cover of the tank, and not, just melt away. Because tanks have, let's say, some small problems with traversing debris and all that other stuff. If it looks like I'm kind of cheating sometimes, unfortunately there's only so much I can do when it comes to all these hidden counters. Technically they're concealed, so they would have attacks against them are halved, because you don't know what specifically you're shooting at and you're hoping for a good result. Also, this is really unlucky for me, because I'm rolling really low with the Russians, so the Germans are hurting here. The guy would have rolled an 8, even with an up 1, it's down 2, so that's a 2 on 8, which it broke both units, of course. So even though I was using the protective qualities of the tank, it clearly wasn't meant to be. I also have to admit that tanks in particular, but vehicles in general in ASL, is still something I haven't fully been able to maximize, we'll say, my efficiency with. There's a lot of concepts that are hard for me to master, in the sense that, like, I don't know specifically where I should be shooting at all times, or what shots are really good for me to take in a tank versus if I should just move up and have my tank like parked next to a unit, even though it could be dangerous for them to do, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things you can do with tanks and vehicles in general, and hoo boy, it just gets overwhelming for a new player if they don't know necessarily what they want to do. And getting back to the concealed stuff, normally speaking, if you had concealed units, like if I was playing simply as the Germans, I wouldn't know anything underneath those concealed counters. I would either assume that there are actually units in there, or that if there are units, they could just be fakes. Another thing to really take away from this is that anything under a counter, under a concealment counter, I don't know what it is. So there could be machine guns there. It could be one squad with 2 machine guns. It could be 2 half squads and a leader. It could be, one guy with 2 demolition charges. All of these things could happen, and it gets it's a little nerve-wracking to play in those sorts of instances, because you need to really take into account everything that could happen, and what shots are worth taking, or do you want to basically bait out shots from the Russians that would force them to drop concealment, and then make your own attacks that much better against them, etc. We can see here that the 2-hit table is a very confusing thing when looked at initially, and just like simply glossed over by somebody. It might seem to be again overwhelming. There's obviously a lot of things to take into account. One thing I don't think I am taking into account is my acquisition that I should have rolled, but we'll see that later. Tanks have a, I guess, unique property in that they have many different weapons on one single counter, and they're allowed to use those all at the same, well, not all at the same time, but they're allowed to use those in sequence, one by one, however you choose. And it becomes very important to keep track of exactly the orientation of your vehicle, orientation of the turret, because that's a separate thing, and what you're shooting at where, because these things, like I said, very important. They can determine whether or not you lose or win, just because of, if I take out this militia koi company unit right now, that opens up like 3 hexes next to them that I can then use to further use as a launching point further south, and etc. So again, these are all things that you really need to consider when playing Advanced Squad Leader. Obviously, a scenario like this, or a campaign game like this, isn't something that you would expect a first-timer to go into. It's very tough for even for me, which I think I'm semi-experienced, maybe not the best or anything. Well, certainly not the best, but in terms of experience-wise, it's definitely something you need to pay attention to, and something that you need to practice a lot with. Here I got unlucky again as the Germans, because even though I had a 16 firepower attack, which is almost halfway towards the best attack you can get in the game, I got a really bad result on my roll, and the Russians made up with it with a really good roll and prevented any sort of break, which means that I now have to put extra resources into attacking that zone in particular. Another thing I guess I should mention is that if a unit attacks somebody as a first fire, their subsequent first fire has to be a unit either closer or adjacent. I think it's adjacent to them. Effectively, what that means is that you need to you can't shoot further than the first time you shot. I forget exactly how it's calculated. I believe that turns are supposed to be like a 2 minute, are supposed to represent 2 minutes of real time. For some reason I have 30 seconds in my mind, but I'm pretty sure it's 2 minutes. So the idea is that while all of these things are happening sequentially in your playthrough, you need to realize that this is why like units can't shoot without a detriment, because only some guns would be able to reload that quickly, or the necessary just like training and all that and getting aimed shots, so good shots, would be something hard to accomplish under combat conditions at the time with those weapons and so on and so forth. It's also another reason why you have a lot of doubling of firepower or half firepower for those sorts of events. For example, a unit that is adjacent to another, I believe hexes are supposed to be like 30 yards or something, or 50 yards. I forget specifically, but the basic gist of it is that because units are so close, when they're adjacent, you can kind of see what targets you should be shooting at, whereas the further out they get, obviously it's hard to shoot people at a further distance. If you've ever done target shooting, even up to 200 yards, it gets really hard to see somebody over open sights, which is what most people would have, quote unquote, back in those days. Not to mention that the inherent problem of what you might be shooting. And this is why certain units have different values for attack and defense, or attack and morale. For example, we see that rifle company units are 4.67s, and the reason for why they have 4 firepower and 6 range is because they're armed mainly with rifles, bolt action rifles. There might be an SMG in there or two, but ultimately not enough that would really be significant. And it means that those rifles can effectively hit people at a longer range. But at the same time, you have the other trade-off, which is, say, with the Sturm Company unit, the 548, because they have 5 firepower, because it's understood that those guys would have had, say, way more in terms of submachine guns and automatic weapons that would prevent people from getting any sort of long distance shots, especially over open sights, because again, submachine guns, you're not getting much range with them in terms of aimed fire and being able to hit your target reliably. The other thing to keep in mind is that certain values, one, shouldn't be taken for like an exact historical representation. There's a lot that I don't want to say is gamified, but you have to kind of take into account that it is a game after all. Here I forgot that the hex E6 was blocking the line of sight, so I have to just roll. I can't. You roll even if you were to shoot and you find out that line of sight was blocked, you still roll, because you can still break guns and do a couple other things, and that's really something you want to mitigate, or it's something you want to make sure that you're rolling for, because you could activate snipers. We'll see that in like 2 videos, I think, where I made a line of sight check, I forgot about it, I rolled, I get a sniper, and then it eventually did something. So it's very important to keep that in mind. But going back to the attack and range values, some attacks, some firepowers might be strictly related or more related to what they are armed with. Could also imply training as well. That also rolls into morale. For example, you might have, like, we see militia units, and under the conditions at the time for Stalingrad, the militia units are meant to be specifically factory workers, members of the civilian population that they basically said, like, hey, here's a gun, we need people in the front line, and we can't have you go back to the rear. You're an able-bodied man. Even if you're 47 or whatever, you can still hold a gun. You can still shoot at some fascists. And that kind of reflects on their morale, because they're not battle troops. They don't really have the ability to survive, quote unquote, in a battlefield situation. But you also have the fact that they're militia means they haven't really been trained with weapons, so they don't have the same sort of proficiency either with managing recoil if they have some machine guns, being able to do aimed fire at distance, even on a clear day, and so on and so forth. So that's why you see all these different firepowers and range values are all different in those ways. And if you actually think about it that way, you can see why it makes there's a lot of sense put into the game. At a face level, it might just seem like, oh, everything's just numbers and stuff, but it makes a lot more sense when you actually try to apply the logic that the game designers were at the time. So I think if a player ever has like questions about this, and you happen to have the rule book with you, this is like the things I'm talking about are represented within the rule book itself. For example, there's a footnote for 1.2.2 in the section A of the rules, which goes on to talk about range. So 1.2.2 says range. And the direct quote from the book is that range is far more than simply a measure of the distance a unit's weapon can shoot. It is also an abstracted measure of the unit's discipline, fire doctrine, training, and willingness to engage an enemy. The player who assumes that his units will fire at any enemy they can see is giving them the benefit of far more heroic and aggressive tendencies than they usually possessed. Fire draws fire in return, and more units sought to duck a fight than to seek one. Now, even though I've read a lot of books and a lot of doctrinal stuff and all that, I'm not 100% well versed on being able to either support or condemn or condone such like declarations. There's some things I do know of. Like first and foremost, it is true that units won't fire at enemy units just because they see enemy units. Sometimes you'd want your enemy units to get closer so that you can decrease the range and the likelihood that you will miss your target. Same sort of applies for like artillery and other stuff like that. Camouflage is also something that is abstracted in this game by the concealment. So you kind of have to take that as a factor of, people are in the houses and you can kind of tell because maybe a window's open or, things look suspicious, but you don't know specifically how many guys are in that building or what necessarily they are doing. On the 2-hit table, we can see that there are 3 different qualities or 3 different types of targets. So you have the vehicle target type, the infantry target type, or the area target type. You can shorten those down to VTT, ITT, or ATT. Basically, it modifies numbers a little bit, but it mainly depends on what you're shooting and how. It should be assumed that Well, I don't mention it. I certainly don't ever mention it in an actual game, and that's my problem, and I should make sure to pay attention to that more often. Um, but when it comes to, say, vehicles and guns, you can shoot different things other than just attacks. Or even more specifically, there are certain types of munitions that you would have access to. So, under normal conditions, my tank might shoot high explosive rounds, but I might also have armor piercing rounds because I want to take out a enemy tank. Or I might want to shoot smoke to create a layer or a cloud of defense and to be able to pass through and so on and so forth. Or even just to eliminate the visibility of the enemy towards myself or my units. At this point, I was being very cautious because we can see that everything in the middle has effectively stopped. I don't have the means to get to any of these wooden buildings or to the stone structures down past this to the south of the road. However, for me, not only did I just check line of sight, and I believe I didn't have it, I forget. Oh, did I actually have? Hey, I did have range, and of course I get another 3 because, duh, right? I've been rolling like under 6 for almost all of the Russians' attacks, which is nuts. Normally you see the average should be 7 to give you an idea. So to roll all these things is pretty good. One of the squads breaks, unfortunately. Even with the modifier, just doesn't do enough. And because the IFT was my Axis Sand, I get to roll a Semper activation, but it didn't do anything. So. At this point, even though I am shooting with the second unit, the thing is when it comes to movement factors, even though like if you use 2 movement factors to get into a building, any number of units can shoot at that 1 movement factor, but to shoot a second time, you need a second movement factor. I'm pretty sure that's correct, anyways. Where is the thing on size? Damn. So yeah, my northern attack doesn't seem to be going too well. Although, keep in mind this is just turn 1. There are 8 total turns that can be played, and each side gets a turn in that game turn. So in reality, this first day can play up to 16 turns, 8 for each side. There's an exception to this, but we won't see it for a while. So I probably won't talk about it for a while. Now that we're defensive fire, the defensive fire phase, it means that the Germans have done all their movement, they don't declare anything else, and the Russians can now freely attack with any units they so choose. Unfortunately for me, I didn't realize that my tank was now perfectly positioned to look straight down the barrel of this 45 long gun. So 45 millimeter gun with double L, which means it's effectively got it's very good at long range, or longer range than other units, or other guns, I should say. And I got a critical hit. Because of course I'm going to get a critical hit on some throwaway shot that I didn't really expect to do anything. And also keep in mind, your stuff like your 2-hit is very important, especially how your tank is facing. I know I mentioned this before, but this is super important. So if you ever play this game and you finally make it to vehicles and you're not quite sure whether it's like your opponent using a vehicle for the first time or yourself using a vehicle for the first time, you really want to keep your facing in, like you want to make sure that's ingrained in your brain. The main reason is that how your vehicle is facing determines where it can and cannot move. So first and foremost, you can't do anything. You can't have a tank move sideways. So in this representation, my tank in O1 can't move to N1. It's not possible because it doesn't have tracks growing at the side of its the hull. Secondly, where it's pointing also determines its armor factors and how well it can defend itself from an attack from that direction. So in this case, it would be a 6 because the attack hits the hull. As we can see, thankfully, Vassal has that built in. So normally, the 45 LL would have a 2-kill number of 11. There's no modifier because of distance, unfortunately. But on a critical hit, you double that number. So that 11 to kill is up to 22. And then you decrease 22 by 6 because that's the armor factor that tank has. So it goes down to 16. There's no way for me to roll a 16 on 2 dice. So automatically it will die. But you still need to determine if you have something like a blaze. So because I rolled another 2, the median is 7. So because I rolled another 2, it means that I was below the under half of the 2-kill number required to kill that tank. Which means that tank not only blows up spectacularly, but it is now on fire as well. There's also a magic number to almost every tank to determine whether or not a crew, so the guys inside the tank, can survive or not. Again, this is all like super crazy stuff. And I've already, I won't forget this later, obviously, but I've forgotten this right now. Basically, because there's a blaze in that hex, it means there should also be smoke in that hex. And smoke can conceal stuff because of the haze brought by the fire, and just like depending on how the fire actually like blows out or whatever. To simplify it, there would just be smoke in that hex, and it makes it so that anybody shooting into that hex has like a +3 or sometimes +2 modifier to their attack, which is why smoke is really good for attacking units. But also fairly okay for defensive units as well. While we're determining another attack by a Russian at point blank range or adjacent range, so it's a 7 on 8 on 8. So one guy gets pinned, and the other's fine. Going back to the rules for a quick second, in chapter A3, at the start, it says each game turn represents 2 minutes of actual time. And this is why you have not only the I go, you go structure, where you can prevent people, like you can stop movement from people. And if I remember correctly, in a interview with John Hill, I think his name is John Hill, the guy who created Squad Leader before it eventually turned into Advanced Squad Leader, the entire reason for the ability to stop units or stop your opponent from moving, shoot at them, and then have them continue their move was because he was annoyed by the fact that in other board games at the time, you could simply say, well, my guys have survived another turn. I will now move them up X amount of distance and are now next to you. In terms of like tanks and other stuff, you can cross distances really easily. So it made it really problematic for defenders to actually be able to do stuff, because your opponent would simply advance his units without really thinking of the negative connotations. In that I mean almost specifically, a tank that moves across a field is a fairly easy target to spot. Maybe not hit specifically, but if you can see where a tank is and where it's going and how fast it's going, you have a generally good idea as to what you need to do in order to attempt to even hit them. And if you hit them, you can go from there. For a tank to be able to move across open ground and not suffer any consequences of that kind of meant, in a way, that you didn't have to worry about positioning of certain units. You didn't have to worry about terrain for certain things. So to have the this ability, quote unquote, to prevent units from being able to do that by simply interrupting their turn, shooting at them, and then letting them continue, it's one of the reasons why Advanced Squad Leader, or Squad Leader and Advanced Squad Leader, in my opinion, is one of the more fun games, because as a player, you are always having to pay attention to the entire battlefield. You can't just say, okay, well, it's your turn. I'm going to go grab some chips, do whatever for 5 minutes, and I'll come back, and once you've done all your moves, then we can continue with our lives, and I can do my stuff again. Another important thing to note, and that we saw a little earlier, the Russian unit that used the anti-tank rifle on the tank, when it shot, it rolled a boxcars. If a support weapon does not have a number underneath another number that I've yet to explain, it will malfunction the gun, and it gets flipped over onto its reverse side. When a weapon is basically turned over, the unit that is carrying it, signified by having it on top of that unit, see here the HMG on top of the 467, the HMG on the 127, and the LMG on the 467. The unit that is carrying it can attempt to repair that thing in a specific phase, and depending on what it is, it might simply just be a roll 1 to repair or roll 6 and you destroy it, and anything in between is a null result. So it's another one of those dangerous things. Do you want to take risky shots? Because this could be the time you get a boxcar with, say, your heavy machine gun, and you've now prevented yourself from using a very powerful tool for X amount of time, or you could simply lose it outright. And this just goes to show that, one, the battlefield is chaotic. You have to have stuff that balances, or that gives players a reason to care about what they do, but also just for the implication that back in the day, they didn't have ammunition that was super stellar and had the same sort of checks and balances that we do these days. Not to say that they were piss poor or anything, but as someone who has an MG34 myself, and I've shot some very old Yugoslavian ammo, that stuff sucks. And maybe it's just because of the way how my firearm is, and that it doesn't specifically like that type of ammo, that sort of thing. It's entirely possible, but it reflects jams that you would have in a firearm, and now those guys have to spend a minute or two to try and unjam the gun, which if you think that's too long of time, like 2 minutes is too long for somebody to try and clear a jam or whatever, you have not had to work with an MG34, so sorry, it's really annoying. If you had something like a Kar 98K, or for the Russians like a Mosin Nagant, or even an SVT-40, yeah, it might be simple as just work the bolt, open it up, mortar it if you have to, or slam it against a piece of wood or something, open it up, and then you eject the round, and then you're good to go, and you don't have to worry about resetting a belt and retightening something and setting up the bipod and making sure that your guy carrying the ammo has is lifting the belt so it doesn't drag on the gun too much, and all of those sorts of crazy factors. When it's just a bolt action rifle for one guy, it's a lot easier to work with. But also can still give you problems, but that level of abstractness is not really something that's necessary in a game like this. You want to add complexity or chrome to it, but you don't want to make it so that it's impossible for you to actually do anything. Another thing we just saw, which is very, very rare in my experience, but I don't believe will be the case the further we move on to this in this campaign game, is a disruption. So normally speaking, a unit that fails a morale check will break, and again flips over to the rear side, and then effectively is combat inoperative for the foreseeable future. If you happen to ELR a unit that breaks to a point where, for example, they are no longer, or if they're conscripts, there's a certain point where a unit can no longer decrease in quality, and basically when that happens, you get a disruption. And a disruption is very interesting because it, as we've seen on the counter itself, it means that you can't route like you normally would, which is a whole sequence in and of itself, but you also can't self-rally. We'll see that in the next video, because you can't do self-rallies until you get to a rally phase, and I'm doing this rally phase at the start of a turn. But the main gist of it is that you're basically locked to wherever you are, which is really bad for certain units, because now that conscript in Hex L3 can't go anywhere. And disrupted units can be susceptible to capture, which yields positives and negatives, but we won't really see that. We won't see it anytime soon. I don't even think... Oh, I never did... there was something I should have done, I think twice, but I forgot about it completely. There are rules for interrogation, because of course there would be. So it is possible to interrogate units once you've captured them, and be able to reveal concealed stuff, or even like if there happen to be mines in play, you could reveal mines, or say like a trench in the back of the territory like we see in J9. Since we're in the advanced fire phase, I guess I should also mention one very important attribute, especially the one what we see on the Sturm Company guys. Specifically, we can see that the firepower on the 548s is underscored. And what that means is that those guys have assault fire. Now, assault fire is very handy because in the advanced fire phase, a unit with assault fire basically gets to add a +1 to their firepower and also round up a fraction. Now, generally speaking, you will round down fractions, which is why rounding up can be very important. In the case of a 548, it means that you would first double their attack power. So if you had a 548, it would go up to 10. You would then divide it because it's no longer, in the case of being adjacent, right? You would double it to 10. You would have it because you're in advanced fire phase, so back down to 5, and then you would add a +1, so it goes up to 6. And again, this represents the fact that these guys had some machine guns. In the case of if it wasn't adjacent, then you would have the firepower, so 2.5. Then you would add 1 to 3.5, and then you would round up, so you'd go up to 4. Under normal circumstances, if you didn't have firepower, if you didn't have assault fire, you would have to 2.5. You wouldn't get a +1, and you wouldn't get to round up. You would round down. So going from a 2 firepower attack to a 4 firepower attack might not seem like a lot, but it gives you an added 1 to whatever your effect is, right? In the fire table, instead of needing, say, a 6 or lower, a 7 will do. And if your median number is 7 and you're feeling good about yourself, that might be something worth taking advantage of. Another thing to keep in mind is that because of the way stacking rules apply and all that, you can create fire groups, which is essentially what you would do if you combine two separate hexes, or the units from two separate hexes, to attack the same target. Granted, both need to have line of sight, and if it turns out that one does not, their attack doesn't count, so you wouldn't calculate that in their firepower, and there's modifiers and stuff that apply. But the general gist of it is that in terms of a fire group, if you had, say, two 5.48s with assault fire attack, then again, you're only losing. If you both had them shoot normally, they would have 8 firepower, because again, 10 firepower goes down to 8. So you would not lose any sort of firepower from attacking with 2 squads in an advanced fire phase, which makes them very strong. And it's also why units with this, advanced fire, generally speaking, will have a higher morale value, because those are the guys that you want to send onto quote-unquote dangerous missions. You want them to close ground. Those are the guys you want to put smoke in front of, if not have them put smoke directly. But you want to put smoke in front of them so that they can move up, do whatever they need to do, and then basically advance and get into close combat, or just shred people from a very short distance. You kind of see this a lot with some of the Russian groups, say the SMG company 527. 2 range is abysmal. I don't think there's something with range 1, other than like a support weapon or 2. So those are the guys you want to protect, have them close the distance, and then basically try to destroy anything they can find from really close up. There is also, underneath their range on the 5.48s and the 5.27s, the underscored range is what's called spraying fire. Frankly, I never use spraying fire. It's not bad, don't get me wrong, and there's a really good purpose for it, but I just never take advantage of it because I don't know. I don't think I find too many situations where it applies to me and my movements. But I'm sure I'll have something to say about that later in different videos where I'll go, oh, you know what? Spraying fire would have been really good here. So spraying fire, the idea is that you can shoot 2 different adjacent hexes with a halved attack. So, for example, if I had the SMG company in 527 use his spraying fire, you would have his firepower, so 2.5, next to the Sturm Company, the 2 Sturm Company groups next to him. But because it's adjacent, you would double his firepower. So it'd go back to a 4 firepower attack on both hexes. It might not seem like all that different or all that special, but at the end of the day, why are they doing construction at this time? Anyways, sorry. Hopefully I'll be able to get that out of the audio. The idea of being able to spray 2 different locations with firepower, even if it's just 4, can be very strong, especially if the units don't have anything to have cover with, or if their cover is only like a +1 or a +2. It's something that you can risk and take advantage of. Now, route phase, so routes get kind of complicated. In plain terms, a unit that routes must route towards the nearest building or woods hex. So, for example, the unit that has broken in N2 has to route towards P3. Technically, if there's another applicable hex further away, it can route to those locations as well, or in spite of its original destination. The one thing you have to keep in mind, however, is that a unit that routes, depending on how it routes, can be interdicted. So the idea is that if the unit in N2 routes towards O3 to get to P3, O3 is an open hex that has no means to prevent somebody from, say, shooting at them without incurring a negative modifier. Because I know there's at least one squad in O1. So if that militia unit moved to O3 and understood that they would get interdicted, what would happen is immediately they take a morale check. If they fail it, they take a casualty reduction. So if they were a full squad, they go down to a half squad. If they're half squad, they get eliminated outright. So if you pass the morale check, you're fine. You don't ever. I don't believe you take interdiction again, and you just go towards. You finish out your move. I could be wrong, and it could be an interdiction applies for every unit that could shoot, but I think it's just one. Furthermore, you can't route towards a known enemy unit. It makes no sense for a unit that is broken to run towards the enemy. There are some weird edge cases about this, however. So, for example, if there was a German unit in, say, L6, or even better, if there's a unit in Q4, because of the line of sight and how it works, the militia company does not know that there is a squad in Q4. So it would technically be legal for him to route to O3 and then end in P3. The only problem with this is that a unit that is routing cannot end its route next to an enemy unit. If they do, they're eliminated. Think of it as the enemy unit knows there's guys in there. They are in no condition to fight back. They get shot dead. Under certain circumstances, they'd just be, say, captured as prisoners, but we'll see that shortly. And sadly, prisoners only apply under certain conditions. Another thing you can do is, let's say that my militia company in N2 again wanted really desperately to go to P3 rather than, say, routing south along the N hex line to get to N5, which would be a legal move. If he really wanted to go to P3, he could declare a low crawl. Low crawl is like a route version of an assault move. Assault move allows you to go one hex to one hex, and not incur that sort of non-assault movement penalty. Whereas a low crawl is the same thing. You can only move one hex, and you can't be interdicted regardless of if it's an open hex or not. So if you happen to find yourself in a very desperate position, you could do that. Again, you have to route towards a building or a woods or building hex. So if there happened to not be anything within, like if there were no buildings in range, you could technically route towards the nearest possible one, even if it was further than the 6 movement factors that you're allotted to a unit that is broken. Similarly, if there were only buildings towards the enemy, you, as far as I understand it, you would then be eliminated because you would have to route forwards or towards an enemy unit. The one exception to this is that if you're routing towards the enemy units but you don't know they're there, technically it wouldn't count for that elimination rule. I think at this point I'm checking the disrupted unit and how routes work specifically. I had the idea that I would give myself enough time and commentary to be able to explain this sort of thing. So far it seems to have worked, but during the Twitch streams when I actually get to them, I'll be letting people know. I'll try to recap stuff, albeit shortly and in detail if people really want to while I'm playing. So one of the major issues in normal ASL is that it gets very tough to manage stacks, because while it might seem like the stack in M2 or the one that I almost just moused over is complicated, they are absolutely real deal scenarios that you will have to deal with. So when you're playing this with your physical counters and stuff, it is possible to get, stacks that are 10 counters high, and you kind of need tweezers at that point, which is a little annoying. Thankfully, Vassal allows you to see an entire stack just by mousing over it, which drastically aids how you go about playing this. Two things I did wrong here. So first, you can't route within the same. You can't go from being adjacent to an enemy to being adjacent to an enemy, even if that would be under other circumstances a legal move. However, you can get away from units even if you're in open ground if you're outside of their normal range. So if we see like a 527, if you're more than 2 hexes away, you don't have to worry about interdiction from that specific unit. Obviously, you have to calculate interdiction from every unit that exists, but it's one of those things that you should keep in mind when routing. So I don't believe. Yeah, I think I just remembered that's not technically a legal move. I'm doing it again, really? Okay, well, for viewers, you're not allowed to go. Like I can't go from I3 to J2. That's not a legal move. I would have had to go to I2 and then J1. That's the only way for that move to be legal. Also, I guess technically I should have routed to I2 and then towards the building in G1 if we're being like 100% strict on that. Because you have to route away from units, it does mean that you have to be careful when attacking, because any ground that you're taking, you want to make sure that you're not losing a bunch of your attacking units to being broken, because you have to route away from units. It also means that when you're on the Russians' turn, if I can't rally those units, they can be not only attacked again, but they could have that DM modifier, that +4 to my rally, reapplied to them. Similarly, a unit that's broken will sometimes have a lower morale than they would when they're at normal fighting capacity, which means that they're worse at defending from fire attacks. They can effectively die easier. There's an easier way for them to die. So you want to keep that in mind, because you could end up with a shortage of men very, very quickly if you don't quite know how to deal with it. Yeah, there I almost made a mistake, but I realized, like, oh yeah, right, disrupt, you can't move. They don't move, period. They can't route normally. This SMG company guy can't stay where he is, so I have to route him away. He wouldn't be able to route directly south, and the units in D3 are within normal range, so I now have to take a morale check on that unit unless I low crawl. If they're broken, trust me, I personally don't like. There's some people I know that will low crawl at most opportunities. I don't like it because I'm just going to lose it anyways. The one exception I can see is that you could low crawl, and thus your opponent would have to maybe take a shot at them in order to quote unquote like truly eliminate them. But while I'm saying this, the other caveat to remember is that a broken unit, if it's adjacent to an enemy unit at any time, it will have its DM counter refreshed. So there's nothing stopping me from, say, next turn, moving that Sturm Company up 1 hex to chase the low crawling unit, and now he's got a DM again, and he's going to have to route all over again. And you can keep doing that, like, ad infinitum, provided there's nothing else that really stops you, of course. Once you're finished with routing, you get into the advanced phase, the APH. Now, the special thing about the advanced phase is that it allows the attacking unit, vehicles not included, to advance, to move 1 hex. Now, there are certain limitations, like if you were to advance a hex that took more than your movement factors, I believe you go into, I believe you get counter exhaustion for that, and there's a couple other things that count as like a, I'm forgetting what the classification is, but it basically would act as a detriment for whatever units are attempting to do that. So advance, it's really helpful because you can get up to a building, but you can't, normally speaking, you wouldn't be able to move into a building with an enemy unit. It wouldn't really make sense if you just, say my 467 next to the 426 over on the left. It wouldn't make sense for those guys to just walk into the building while they can be shot at, because that's not going to work out properly. So normally you would just get right next to your opponent, shoot at them, and then try to blitz them for what we'll see shortly, I think. Right now I'm checking the rules, and I should come away with the understanding that a unit that is disrupted will automatically surrender to an enemy unit, provided that unit is adjacent to them. So this militia company should, under those circumstances, because they now find themselves adjacent to my guys in L2, they will now surrender to them. Now, a unit that surrenders does not stay the same counter. Basically what happens, it gets exchanged for a prisoner counter, and then that prisoner counter has to then be guarded by a unit, by a German unit. And there's no there's no going around that. You have to now guard them. There is an option to kill units that are surrendering, but for the purposes of this video right now, I'm not going to bother doing it. I might get to it in a later video or something, but yeah, that won't be the case right now. So I want to keep track. I'm trying to keep track of all the different units that get added, who goes where, and all that sort of stuff. Because I think it'd be really fun to track how many units have been lost. And an additive I'm going to be trying to do, don't hold me to this please, but what I'm going to be trying to do is keep stats on how many units have died and so forth, while also keeping tabs on just from a historical perspective, where would the Germans have been, or where would the Russians have been at this time and place? Because thankfully, I own a lot of World War II books that are also that do deep dives on certain subjects. One of them being a collection of, I think, 4 books as a very in-depth day-to-day view of Stalingrad. There's a lot of different histories out there about Stalingrad. There's quite a few good ones. So, if anybody's got book recommendations, I would definitely appreciate to see them in the thread itself on Something Awful. Mainly because it gives me something extra to read, or to see a different perspective on stuff, and just different sources throughout the years and so on. It's, for me, I love that stuff. There's a little bit of a lull here in what I'm doing, because I'm checking up on the rule to make sure I'm completely understanding it, because prisoners rarely happens for me. This is the first time I've seen it in probably about 2 years, and even way back then, that was the first official time I had ever gotten prisoners. So when you get prisoners, when you finally capture somebody, you can you're automatically allowed to deploy a unit. So basically, what this means is the game designers realized that if you had prisoners with you, one, it makes sense to keep those prisoners alive. They're worth stuff, and there are certain scenarios that are built around capturing guys or having victory points, which you can. It's a whole other thing, but basically, prisoners count for victory points, and if you obviously if you keep them alive, they're worth a lot. But the developers that made this game realized that it wouldn't make sense to lose an entire squad, because that could be a really good squad. You might really want those guys on the front lines or doing something. So they put in that you can deploy your unit. So if it's a full squad, you can split them into 2 half squads. One half squad takes charge of the prisoners, and you can do whatever you want with them. Generally speaking, you will return them to the rear lines, for those victory points. Or again, if you choose not to do that because maybe it's a 5-4-8, and you don't want to lose those guys, or you don't want to split them up, and you're doing a really good job pushing forward, you can declare to massacre those prisoners, and then that's it. Like, for the rest of that day, no prisoners can be taken. They will die automatically. So there's a lot of things to consider. Some rules are automatic based on time of year, or even which year it is specifically. So again, while it's Chrome, it's something to think about. Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues that one can definitively say about Advanced Squad Leader is that due to the nature of the game, you are going to the rulebook. If you don't fully understand the rules, you do go to the rulebook fairly often, and thankfully in today's digital age, with the existence of online manuals and stuff, and I have all the manuals, so I hope nobody comes to me and tries to complain about having the online stuff. But having those resources makes it really easy, and I know Multi-Man Publishing is going to eventually get their own online thing. It's really useful because I can just hit Control F and look for what I want, rather than having to go through the index in the paper format, because it's just that much slower. Again, it might sound like I'm knocking the product, but in all honesty, I really love the idea of having so many rules. Not specifically so many rules that it's super boring or whatever, but more specifically having so many rules that all tend to make sense. I don't ever feel like what I'm doing would be illogical from a historical perspective or a game perspective. To me, when I look at how it plays out and stuff, I can picture it happening and making sense that way. So finally, I realized, I can deploy my unit automatically. I don't lose anything by doing that. And now I'm getting to the end of the advanced phase. You can see why sometimes I will hit the move button at the top of the screen, basically to remove that moved text to it, so that I don't have to worry about, I know which units have now moved for advancing, versus that I moved during the move phase, because it can get very confusing if you don't try to do your own upkeep on that sort of thing. And finally, we're coming near the end, not only of this video, but to the end of the first turn. So the last complete phase that we're doing is the close combat phase. Typically, this you won't have anything to do during the close combat phase, unless you have units occupying the same hex, like we do in what is that? C3. So in C3, there's a building that I've had 3 separate units advance into. Whenever you advance into a building, woods, and I believe there's a couple other things, especially in the Pacific, you have the opportunity to inflict an ambush. So ambush we see at the bottom left of the screen, or did see it at the bottom left of the screen. And effectively what happens is, if your dice roll is 3 under the opponent, then you effectively ambush them. I believe you can't go below 0 or 1, because that, I don't know, to me that wouldn't make sense, but maybe I have that wrong. And basically I don't believe there's an ambush that occurs in this. Keep in mind it's less than 3, not less or equal. We can see that's very important, even just to the leader creation table to the right. It must be less than 3. So, or it must, yeah, less than under than 3, whatever. Anyways, once you've determined whether or not you have an ambush, you then go on to determining ratios and how you want people to fight each other, because you're allowed to choose. So if there was an ambush by the Russians would determine what they would want to do. They then roll first, and if they kill whatever, like if they kill anything, then that happens before the Germans get to react. It can be super handy to force that sort of thing on your opponent. So if you know that they have, say, like, if you know they're stunned, or if you know that they're lax, so they're not alert. If you know they have a bad leader, and you do that sort of thing, or they do that thing to you, it gets really good because you can mess with them. And then you're calculating your ratios. So I believe in this instance I had the Russian target one of the 467s, and all of the Germans were targeting the one Russian. So all of the Germans targeting the one Russian means it would be a 12-4. So it's a 3-to-1 ratio. You don't apply TEM, and you basically go on the CCDRM that you would see on that table. There were no modifiers for the Germans, and the Russians didn't have any modifiers either. But because I was only targeting one of the 3 German squads, I would then apply a 1-to-1 ratio on my attack. Because I need like a 4, and I obviously rolled an 8, it means I needed a 5. But because I rolled an 8, I didn't get underneath that special number, so they lose. The Germans here roll a 4, and the Russians are going to roll an 11. Because I was running on a 2-to-1 ratio, I needed a 7, and the Russians were going on a 1-to-1 versus an enemy squad, and again needed a 5. And that's what happens in close combat. You can have close combats, like I got lucky with the Germans for having both roll the number I needed, but in other circumstances, in fact, in later videos, we'll see there will be certain scenarios where I will lose, a melee will be in effect for like 4 turns or 4 combat phases. So yeah, it gets pretty crazy. I was trying to do something to get, like, I know I saw somebody do this once where they were able to put like nice text on the board, and I was trying to do something so that I could get like something for the viewers for once and if I eventually go live on Twitch, then like I won't have to explain it all that much. It'll just be, hey guys, there's a dead pile and it's over here. I'm sure I'll figure it out at some point. Probably not, but you know, whatever. So that's basically it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I absolutely love playing Advanced Squad Leader, and it's madness that I'm going to try and do a Stalingrad game, especially doing it solo. It's going to be pretty crazy for me to even get like past a week, because I have like 12 hours of footage just in day one. So yeah, be prepared to see more of this. Excited to see like just how far I can take this. Again, I will try to do some bonus videos or some extra content to just for like showing off like what the historical position was of people, and like what's the disposition of the different units, and why is it that there are certain modifiers to certain units at certain times, or even, you know, why the decision was made to have, say, 3 Panzer III Ls, or whatever, Ls, attacking today rather than having, say, some other tanks, or what was available to the Germans at the time versus what the Russians had available, and so on and so forth. And here's me remembering smoke in the location of the blaze. Anyways, I will see you hopefully next time. 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 Hopefully